was the 9th hour of a Friday morning in Jerusalem. 4 Roman soldiers stood at the base of 3 crosses on a hill the locals called Golgotha, the place of the skull. Their commanding officer, a centurion with years of service behind him, watched from a distance as a Jewish preacher slowly died. To these men, this was not a historic moment. It was not even a memorable one. By their count, this was the 4th crucifixion detail they had drawn that week. They knew exactly how it worked, exactly how long it would take, and exactly what they were supposed to do when it was over. They were professionals. And then the sky went dark at noon. To understand what happened to these men on that Friday, what they saw, what they feared, and what at least one of them said out loud in the final hour, you have to first understand who they were. Not as background figures in a story written about someone else, but as men with their own beliefs, their own gods, and their own way of reading the world. The 4 soldiers assigned to each crucifixion formed what Roman military law called a quaternio, a standard execution detail. We know there were exactly 4 of them because John's account records them dividing the condemned man's garments into 4 equal parts. Their commander was a centurion, the backbone of the Roman military system. A centurion did not earn his rank through birth or politics. He earned it through 2 decades of service, through demonstrated courage under fire, and through the kind of judgment that kept 80 men alive in hostile territory. These were not impressionable young recruits. These were the most experienced soldiers Rome produced. They were almost certainly not Roman-born. The historian Tacitus confirms that Judea under Pontius Pilate was garrisoned primarily by Syrian auxiliaries, provincial soldiers recruited from the eastern reaches of the empire. This matters because it means their religious world was already a blend. Roman military gods, Jupiter, Mars, the sacred genius of the emperor, layered over regional Syrian beliefs. They were polytheists in the fullest sense. The gods were everywhere, in everything, and they communicated constantly with the world they had made. Roman soldiers were deeply, practically superstitious. Not superstitious in the way we use that word today, dismissively to mean irrational. Superstitious in the sense that they paid close attention to signs. The gods maintained the order of the cosmos in exchange for correct ritual and correct interpretation. When the gods were displeased or when something of great weight was about to happen, the world itself changed. The sky changed. The earth moved. Animals behaved strangely. A soldier who ignored these signs was not brave. He was negligent. He was failing in his duty to read the world correctly. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, documented Roman belief in atmospheric signs as divine communication, sudden darkness, unexplained cold, the sun behaving wrongly. These were not weather events, they were messages, and the Roman military had a formal institutional procedure for them. A prodigium, an omen of divine significance, had to be reported up the chain of command and ritually addressed by the Senate. The gods were not distant or silent. They spoke through the material world, and it was the soldier's job to listen. All of this was the worldview these 4 men carried with them up the hill to Golgotha. Crucifixion, the crux, was Rome's most degrading punishment. Cicero wrote that the very word should be kept far not only from the body of a Roman citizen but from his thoughts, his eyes, and his ears. It was reserved for slaves, for rebels, for the worst category of non-citizen offenders. It was not designed to simply kill. It was designed to humiliate, to deter, and to make a public statement about what Rome did to those who challenged its authority. To the soldiers who administered it, this carried no moral weight. It was crowd control. It was order enforcement. It was their job. They had walked behind the condemned man through the streets of the city. Standard procedure required the condemned to carry the crossbeam, the patibulum, through as many public thoroughfares as possible. Maximum visibility. Maximum deterrent. At some point on the road, a man named Simon from Cyrene was compelled to carry the beam instead. This was not unusual. Roman soldiers in Judea had the legal right under Angaria law to conscript any provincial to carry loads for up to a Roman mile. The centurion exercised this right without ceremony. He was watching the crowd, not the prisoner. The crowd was always the real threat. When Pilate had been brought to Jerusalem years before, his troops had marched into the city carrying imperial standards bearing the image of the emperor, an image the Jewish population considered idolatrous. The resulting protest had nearly become a massacre. Josephus records that Pilate had eventually backed down only after Jewish demonstrators offered to die rather than allow the standards to remain. The centurion on this execution detail would have known this history. He would have known that this city, on this festival week, with its population swollen by pilgrims from across the region, was as volatile as any battlefield he had ever stood in. He was watching the crowd. At Golgotha, the soldiers did what soldiers do. They worked. The condemned were nailed to the crossbeams and raised. A wooden sign, the titulus, was fixed above each cross to identify the crime. Above the Jewish preacher, Pilate had ordered the inscription written in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The chief priests had objected to the wording. Pilate had refused to change it. The soldiers read it, noted it, and moved on. To them, it meant sedition, political insurrection. That was why they were here. Then they did something that tells us more about their state of mind than almost anything else recorded that morning. They gambled. John records that the 4 soldiers divided the condemned man's garments between them, a standard legal entitlement of the execution detail. When they came to the seamless tunic, rather than tear it, they cast lots for it. A tessera, a small Roman die, passed between them on the ground below the cross. They were relaxed enough to gamble. Whatever tension they carried in their bodies from managing the crowd through the city had eased. The crosses were up. The perimeter was established. They settled in to wait. Crucifixion was slow. A man could hang for hours, sometimes for days. The soldiers knew this. They had done it before. Then the 6th hour came. Noon. The sun was directly overhead, and it went dark. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the same thing independently. From the 6th hour to the 9th hour, a darkness came over the land. 3 hours, from noon to 3 in the afternoon. The middle of the day, gone. This is one of the most examined details in ancient history. Julius Africanus, a 3rd century historian, references a record by Thales, a 1st century pagan writer, who attempted to explain this darkness as a solar eclipse. This matters. A pagan historian writing in the 1st century, with no theological stake in the story, apparently felt this event needed a natural explanation. Something had been recorded that required accounting for. But Thales's explanation does not hold. A solar eclipse lasting 3 hours is physically impossible. More critically, Passover occurs at the full moon, and solar eclipses can only occur at new moon, when the moon passes between the earth and the sun. At full moon, the geometry is exactly reversed. Whatever the soldiers were standing under for those 3 hours, it was not a solar eclipse. Even ancient commentators noted this. Stand where those soldiers stood. The middle of the day. The sky wrong. Not evening dark, not overcast dark. Wrong. 3 hours of it. A Roman soldier watching this did not reach for a meteorological explanation. He reached for the only framework his world had given him. The gods were communicating. Something of enormous weight was happening, and the sky was saying so. Pliny documented that midday darkness was among the most terrible portents in Roman tradition. It was associated with divine anger, with the disruption of cosmic order, with the death of great men. After Julius Caesar's assassination, the poet Virgil wrote that the sun had hidden its face in mourning. Romans had a complete vocabulary for this, for the sky participating in human events. They did not need to invent that vocabulary on the spot. It was already there. These 4 soldiers were standing under an unexplained midday sky in a province their commanders back in Rome considered spiritually unstable, next to the crosses of 3 men, one of whom their superior officer had just been arguing with the city's religious authorities about all morning. Whatever professional detachment they had brought up the hill with them was being tested. Then the man on the center cross died, and the earth moved. Matthew records that at the moment of death, there was an earthquake. Geological research published in the International Geology Review in 2012 examining sediment layers from the Dead Sea, identified a seismic event in the Judean region consistent with the 1st century. The earth had moved. The record in the stone agrees with the record in the text. For the soldiers, an earthquake immediately following 3 hours of impossible darkness was not coincidence. In Roman religious thought, coinciding portents multiplied in meaning. One sign was a message. 2 signs arriving together was something else entirely. The technical term was prodigium. A portent so significant it required formal ritual response at the highest levels of the state. These events were not private religious feelings. They were institutional obligations. The centurion had been watching the man die. He had watched hundreds of men die. He had stood at the foot of crosses before and seen the specific, particular way crucifixion ended a life. Mark's account notes that he was standing directly in front of the cross, and that he saw how Jesus died. Something about the manner of it, combined with the darkness, combined with the earth shaking beneath his boots, produced in this experienced, unsentimental military man a response that was recorded and transmitted for 2,000 years. He said, "Surely this was the Son of God," or as Luke records it, "Certainly this was a righteous man." These are not contradictory accounts. Luke was writing for a Greek audience and may have translated the centurion's meaning into philosophical terms his readers would understand. Matthew preserved the more theologically loaded expression. Both accounts agree on the essential fact. The centurion made a public declaration about the identity of the man he had just watched die. What did he mean? In Roman religion, the phrase son of a god, divi filius, was not an exclusive theological claim. It was a category. Roman mythology was built on men of divine origin. Hercules, Achilles, Romulus, the founder of Rome himself. Emperor Augustus bore the official title Divi Filius, son of the deified Julius Caesar. The phrase described a class of being, human in form, but touched by something beyond the human, a hero in the original sense, a man whose deeds and whose death carried divine weight. The centurion almost certainly did not mean what the gospel writers understood him to mean. He was not making a Christian confession. He was reaching for the nearest category his world had given him for what he had just witnessed, a man who died in a way that made the sky go wrong and the earth move. And that category was hero, divine origin, not an ordinary man. But the gospel writers recorded those words because within their framework, the centurion had said something true in a way he did not fully understand. A Roman soldier with no knowledge of Jewish prophecy, no stake in the theological argument, no reason to say anything at all, had looked at what happened and reached the same conclusion they had. In different language, from a different direction, through a different door. Matthew records that the other soldiers, the full quaternio, shared the centurion's fear. They were terrified, the text says. These were not men who frightened easily. The practical work continued. The Jewish religious authorities needed the bodies removed before sundown and the beginning of Sabbath. Jewish law required it. Deuteronomy specified that a body hanging on a tree must not remain overnight. They asked Pilate to have the deaths hastened. The standard Roman method was crurifragium, breaking the legs, removing the ability of the condemned to push upward and breathe, accelerating death by suffocation. The soldiers broke the legs of the 2 men crucified beside Jesus. When they came to Jesus, they found he was already dead. One of the soldiers took a spear and thrust it into his side. John records that blood and water flowed from the wound, a detail that modern forensic medicine recognizes as consistent with a post-mortem cardiac wound. The soldier's gesture was procedural, confirmation of death. He was filing his report with his body. Then came a different assignment. The chief priests went to Pilate and asked for a guard at the tomb. Their concern, they said, was that the disciples would steal the body and claim a resurrection. Pilate gave them soldiers, likely from the same garrison that had managed the execution. The tomb was sealed. The guard was posted. The duty rotation began. Think about what those soldiers knew as they took their positions. They had stood on a hill 3 days earlier under a sky that had gone wrong. They had felt the earth move. Their centurion had said something that was now being talked about in the barracks. And now they were guarding the sealed tomb of the man who had been at the center of it, a man their centurion had called son of a god. against the possibility that something further would happen. Within Roman superstition, guarding the tomb of a potential heroes, a semi-divine hero, carried its own weight of unease. These were not comfortable men on a routine assignment. What happened at the tomb, the soldiers did not report to Pilate. They reported to the chief priests. Matthew records that they were paid a significant sum of money to say that the disciples had stolen the body while the guard slept. Consider what that bribe was actually asking them to accept. Under Roman military law, documented in the Digest of Justinian, drawing on the military jurist Arius Menander, a soldier sleeping on watch faced execution. Not demotion, not discipline, execution. The story the chief priests were purchasing was one that put the soldiers who told it in legal danger of their lives, and they accepted payment to use it anyway. We do not know what the soldiers saw at the tomb. The record does not give us that. What the record gives us is that their explanation, the one they were paid to provide, was one they themselves knew could get them killed. Something had made that risk worth accepting. The centurion's name was never recorded. Eastern Christian tradition, writing several centuries later, called him Longinus, and connected him also with the soldier who thrust the spear. But that identification comes from the 4th century, not the 1st. The historical record gives us his words and nothing else. What it gives us is this: a man who had spent his career in the Roman military, who had learned to read the world through omens and portents and the language of the gods, who had stood on a hill in Judea on a Friday morning expecting a routine execution. That man looked at everything that happened between the 6th hour and the 9th and reached for the most significant category his world had given him. He was not a follower. He had no theology that prepared him for this. He had no prophecy in his background that told him to expect it. He had only what he saw: 3 hours of wrong sky, a man dying in a manner that did not fit the script of the hundreds of deaths he had witnessed before, and an earth that shook when it was over. And in the dark, at the foot of the cross, in the language of a soldier and not a saint, he said what he saw. These men did not go to Golgotha to witness a turning point. They went because it was on the duty roster. What they believed when they arrived, that this was a routine execution in a difficult province, did not survive the morning. What replaced it, we can only read in the fragments they left behind: a word spoken into the dark, a bribe accepted at great personal risk, and a report that, if it was ever written, has never been found.